Welcome back. If you're not coming back and this is the first video you're watching, please be aware that it's probably about the fourth video in the series and you might want to back up and see some of the earlier ones. In this video, I'll be talking about the materials and methods section of a scientific report, such as a laboratory report you might write for a science class in college. It also applies to more serious scientific writing, so a master's thesis, a doctoral dissertation, or even an article for a peer-reviewed journal. As I've mentioned in some of the prior talks, and I'll keep mentioning in these talks, the typical organization of a scientific paper involves a title, followed by an abstract, which summarizes the entire paper. But if it's something very short, like a laboratory report, probably you do not need the abstract. That's followed by an introduction, which many people call a literature review, because the best introductions are almost entirely a review of the literature, followed by just a paragraph or two that's more specific to the report itself. After the introduction comes the materials and methods section. That's what I'll be focusing on in this video. After the materials and methods section comes the results section. You'll often see tables and figures showing up in the results section of laboratory reports, and that's followed by yet another section, usually called the discussion, that presents the meaning of the results. And if anywhere within the paper you wrote about other people's research, other people's presentations, then you would also have a reference list, sometimes just called references, that give more detailed information to help a reader go find those documents, and they can then go and read those things for themselves. So in this video, I'll be focusing on the methods section. Sometimes it's called method, sometimes it's called methods, sometimes it's called materials and methods, depending on the class or the journal or the thing that you're writing. So what's the goal? What's the purpose? Well, the purpose of a method section is to clearly, it's a key word, clearly describe the method used in the study. So this section of a report is all about how the research was done. What precisely was done? Okay, so this section needs to include clear descriptions of a number of things, depending on what your experiment involved, depending on what your research was. So did you use any equipment? Was there any apparatus, any machines, a scale, anything? These types of things, did you use them? Well, if you use them, they need to be described. Because if you don't describe it, then the reader will not know precisely what you used. They might then go and do a replication of your study, and if they don't know what you used, they might use something different and get a different answer and not know why. So it's very important to describe any equipment that you used. What did you use in your research? Now, if you collected data from people, in the past in science, we called them subjects in the research. So there were 100 subjects in my research. That wording, though, has changed over the past few decades, and nowadays most people do not use the word subjects anymore, but you will see it if you read a lot of scientific research. Today we use the word participants because they are participating in our research by giving us answers to our questionnaires or doing whatever it is we've asked them to do in our laboratory. So they are participants in the research. So nowadays we use the term participant and participants. If your research does not involve humans, it still probably involved something. Maybe you were looking at cows' teeth. Okay, I don't know. Whatever it was you were looking at, those things studied need to be described clearly in the method section so that the reader will know precisely what it was that you used. Did you perform any tests? Now this word test, very general. It'll completely depend on the research. Maybe you're doing some sort of medical or sports related research and you drew blood. You had blood samples taken from your participants and analyzed for oxygen content or lactose acid content or whatever it might be. Okay, so there was a blood test. Maybe it was a math test. I'm a professor. I might give my students a math test and their scores on the test. That's also a test. So there's all sorts of things that would be tests. But did you do any tests? If so, they need to be described to your reader. If you're doing any research that involves chemicals, particularly if you're in medicine, it would involve drugs, but I'm guessing most viewers of this video are not yet doing that level of research. But if you're in a chemistry class, you're probably using chemicals. Well, which chemicals? The reader will need to know. Your method section needs to clearly let your reader know what precisely you used. And don't forget the amounts. The amount is critical. There's a big difference between 1 milligram of something and 1 kilogram of that same substance. The result of the research might be quite different depending on how much of the substance gets used. So think about any substances you use, any supplies you used, and if the amounts would matter, how much was used. Now, this basically covers many of the details of things that were needed to do the research, but you also need in your method section a very clear description of the procedure. What did you do first? What did you do second? What was done? If the order matters, then you also need to specify what the order is. So you can actually think about the methods section of a laboratory report. It's sort of like a recipe. So like there's a recipe for baking cookies. So you mix the butter and the sugar in one bowl. And in a separate bowl, you mix the flour, the baking powder, and the baking soda. And then you put the eggs one at a time into the butter and sugar mixture, mix in one egg, and then add the second egg, and so on. I won't bore you with my chocolate chip cookie recipe. Maybe I already have. But there's a recipe. So there are ingredients, and there's procedure. You need both in your method section. So make sure that your method section provides, in paragraph style, this is written form, paragraphs made up of sentences, so topic sentence, supporting sentences, conclusions. So paragraphs that presents the recipe for conducting the research. Okay? So it needs all the ingredients, and that again has to be in sentence and paragraph form. It should not just be a list. For this research, the following items were used. Full colon, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. No, not like that. Sentences, paragraphs. Imagine you're explaining what you did in your research to your roommate. Okay, how would you say it? Think about paragraphs and sentences. So make sure all the ingredients get listed and make sure that a detailed procedure is provided. Okay, and of course that will use the ingredients you've just talked about. So the goal of the method section is to let the reader know what you did. That means they need to know all of the ingredients and how those ingredients were used. So what was used and how it was used. And this, of course, needs to be done very clearly. Why? Because a careful reading of a materials and methods section should let some other researcher who has the supplies, if they have the same supplies, they should be able to replicate the study. They should be able to do the exact same research, do the exact same experiment, so that they can see if they get the same results as you did. So you need to list all the ingredients. They should not have to guess what you used. They should not have to guess about the procedure. Everything should be very clearly stated in the method section so that another reader could read it and say, oh, I want to do that research too. And they could then go and do it just based on the instructions given in the materials and methods section. Now, in terms of the design of writing it, because ultimately you're going to open up a word processor and you're going to start writing this section, what should you do? Well, there's two broad approaches. They're actually almost the same, but there's two ways that people think of it. One is to write a unitary section, one whole section that is the materials and methods section. The other approach is to break down the information and present subsections. So you have your materials and methods, and then you have a section on the participants, and then a section on the materials that were used, and then a section on the procedures that were used. In either case, it's going to be about the same. It's really more of a difference of do you want to put in the subheadings or not. But think about how complicated is what you're doing, how many pages is it. If it's only a page long, then you probably don't need subsections. But you can do it either way. You can do it as a unitary section, or as is shown here, you could have methods as the section title, and then you could have subsections such as materials and procedure. And you'll notice that I keep writing paragraph style, paragraph style. Again, this is not a list. It's not just a set of pictures, though in a method section you might want to include a photograph of your experimental setup. You set up the experiment, take a photo with your cell phone if you have one, or bring a little camera to your experiment, take a picture or two. It might help your reader see what it was you were doing. Or you might want to include a diagram. So go into some software like PowerPoint or some other thing where you can draw simple pictures and lay out a diagram showing what it was you did or what the experimental setup looks like. So it could actually have other things than paragraphs, but it does not have those things instead of paragraphs. The paragraphs are always there. So in paragraph style, what are the materials? What was the procedure? In terms of class reports, is there a standard? Well, it'll vary based upon your professor, what they like. I think more professors like the subsection approach. So if I was doing a report in a class, I would probably create subsections. But many scientific journals prefer not to bother unless it's very long, unless it's many pages long. So I'll leave that up to you as to what you want to do, but you might want to check with your professors to see if they have a particular style that they prefer in terms of how to write your reports. Last, I want to close up with just a few little linguistic notes. Okay, so the method section. What tense should you use? Well, strictly speaking, but I may change this a little bit in a moment. Strictly speaking, there's actually lots of options. There's lots of options, but people tend to expect or like a particular way better. Generally, a method section should probably be written in the past tenses. So the goal is to explain, what did you do? Okay, what was done? The other option, which I do not recommend, but you might see it if you read a lot of scientific work, is to use the present and future tenses. And instead of saying what was done, you explain to the reader how they would replicate your research. So basically you are saying what was done, but you're using present and future tenses as if giving instructions to them, to your reader, telling them how to go about performing a replication study of the research. In the case of scientists who are trying to publish in scientific journals, there's actually usually a document called Instructions to Authors that tells us how they want it done. But for a class report, and if you're not quite sure what you should use, I would say go with the past tenses. It's always the safest, and usually it's preferred. So describe what you did. What did you do? You can describe that in your materials and methods section. A few other little notes. This next one is a little bit weird because it has to do with scientific writing, not scientific speaking, and not formal English. So let me jump into this. In scientific writing, and particularly modern scientific writing, we're supposed to avoid or completely avoid using the words I, we, and similar words like you or our or my. These types of words, we're not supposed to use them. 50 years ago, in scientific writing, nobody really cared so much if you used them. But today, in modern English scientific writing, it's considered poor style to use I and we and you within written documents. Now, you might notice if you're paying very close attention to these videos and my wording, I sometimes am using these words, but that's spoken formal academic English. It's fine. In non-scientific formal English, using these words is usually fine. But in scientific English, in writing, you're not supposed to use these words. So what do? Well, what you do is you use passive voice. In almost every case, you can convert a sentence that started with I or we into a passive voice version. For example, let's say you want to write, I heated the mixture to 40 degrees Celsius. Well, you're not supposed to use I, but change it to passive voice. It's very easy. The mixture was heated to 40 degrees Celsius. So again, this is written scientific English. In normal written English outside of science, you wouldn't need to worry about this. But for scientific English, go for the passive voice. Okay? So if you did your research with some other people and you wanted to write, we measured the temperature every 30 seconds. Instead, write, the temperature was measured every 30 seconds. It conveys the same information, but does so without using I, we, and similar words. It does not come up often, but occasionally you'll find yourself in a situation where passive voice doesn't work, or it just sounds very, very awkward. In those cases, instead of using I or we, then use something like the present author. So the present author undertook this research in order to, boom, 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 okay? Or the present investigator. If there's more than one of you, then the present researchers or the present authors concluded that, boom, boom, boom. But usually, passive voice will work fine. So where possible, use passive voice rather than one of these alternates to the words I and we. I know it's a strange one, but that's modern scientific English writing. So those are a few thoughts on writing method sections and scientific writing in general. In future videos, we'll be looking at the results section and the discussion section and a few other things. So remember, for the method section, paragraph style, make sure it has all of the ingredients, make sure the procedure is clearly presented, and make certain that the reader will understand it. So if it would help to give a photograph of the experimental setup or a diagram of the experimental setup, include that as well. Not instead of the paragraphs, but in addition to help your reader. Write it so that a reader reads your method section and they understand, I know exactly how this was done. In fact, if I have the ingredients, I could go do the research right now. Thank you for watching.